Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We're here today with Cristina Rathbone. Cristina is an award-winning journalist, Episcopal priest, and spiritual director. She's the author of a new book titled The Asylum Seekers, a chronicle of life, death, and community at the border. Her previous books include On the Outside Looking In, A Year in an Inner City High School, and A World Apart, Women, Prisons, and Life Behind Bars. In partnership with Episcopal Migration Ministries, she founded Neighbor Neighbor, a national network that supports congregations as they accompany newly arrived asylum seekers. Christina now serves as a congregational coordinator, congregational coordinator for immigration with the Massachusetts Council of Churches. You can learn more about her new book at broadleafbooks.com. So Christina, thanks so much for joining us and congratulations on all of this amazing work that you've done.
Thank you. Thanks for having me here. I'm really grateful.
Well, it's a conversation I've been looking forward to. Is there anything else you'd like people to know about you besides what I kind of briefly touched on there?
I think that's a pretty good start. There's always more things. I've got two grown children who I'm very proud and grateful to know in the world. But otherwise, I think that's a good overall sketch.
Okay. Well, before we get into your new book, could you talk about the other work that you've done before the work at the border?
Yes. So, do you mean book work or general work?
General first. We'll start with that, and then we'll
General
talk
work.
about your
Um,
book.
Before I went to the border, I was working in downtown Boston with a community of unhoused people out of the Episcopal Cathedral. I'm an Episcopal priest. And I formed and shaped a community in partnership with the unhoused community there. And together we got up to lots of mischief and good trouble, and also lots of prayer and worship and work on behalf of others, the broader community, people who are unhoused and hungry, and really mostly held a space for us all to learn from one another, which is the thing that I most love to do,
Hmm.
to meet people and learn from them better about how to be and become a full human being, which I feel like is all of our tasks all of the time.
Very cool. Well, even just from the titles of your two books, you can already tell they're pretty interesting things. So, can you talk about those a little bit?
Yeah, so I've had a kind of varied life. I went to school to study film and then ended up writing because it was much cheaper, right? Just you just needed a pen and a piece of paper rather than to raise hundreds of thousands of dollars. But my interest has always been in people's realities and their lives. And so instead of making documentary films, I started writing. I was living in New York at the time, and I ended up writing my first book about New York City's last chance high school. It was a school called West Side High, where kids, brilliant kids and gifted kids who had been pushed out of the education system, either they'd ended up in the criminal justice system or they'd been expelled from their local high schools. They all ended up in this one high school.
Hmm.
And I wrote about that school and the extraordinary principal, Ed Reynolds, who's now passed away, and most of all about the kids and who they were and how they were and what kind of obstacles they faced and how they, mostly with incredible courage and imagination, overcame those
Hmm.
obstacles. And I thought after finishing that book that the next project would be about women in prison. Um, no, sorry, would be about those some of those kids in prison. But that became the power imbalance was too massive between an incarcerated juvenile subject of a book and a free adult journalist. So I
Hmm.
ended up, without thinking too much about it, deciding to do a book about women in prison. Um, and it was good I didn't think too much about it because it was sort of an impossible task, which only someone with a certain amount of naivety could just barge into and complete. And that took a lot of time, many years, 5 years. And that was a book about the contemporary lives of five different women incarcerated here in Massachusetts. And that prison is the oldest running women's prison in the country. So it was also telling the stories of women from history who were incarcerated there and also women who ran that prison. It was a very, very fascinating story of incarceration in this country, fascinating and ultimately quite depressing.
Hmm. Hmm. Do you still stay in touch with or stay aware of, some of the students from the high school or from the prison?
I'm in touch with one or two people, but it's hard over the years to stay in
Mm-hmm.
touch with people from all these different lives.
Sure, sure. So let's get into the new book. As I mentioned, the title is The Asylum Seekers, a Chronicle of Life, Death, and Community at the Border. So can you tell everyone how this came about?
Yeah, when it came time for me to leave the homeless community in Boston, it was the beginning of the first Trump administration. And the newspapers were full of stories of the suffering of people trying to come into this country. And my own family, my mother's family, are Cuban, and all of them arrived here in this country with one suitcase each and had to make new lives. And they were then given the benefit of the doubt and were allowed that opportunity to start all over again. Hard enough to do, but at least they had that chance. But then in 2019, no one was being given that chance. So I figured I should go to the border and find out from the people who were primarily affected what I, as a priest and a person, could do, and a person holding an American passport, and also what we as the church could do in partnership with asylum seekers at the border to help alleviate suffering for all of us.
Well, it's really an eye-opening book, at least for me, and just kind of trying to imagine myself in your shoes and what you were doing. And I really want people to read the book, but I mean, can you give folks a flavor of what it was like to go through the many months that you were there?
Oh, it was really difficult. It was far and away the most difficult thing I've ever done. Not because my life was so very hard, but because the lives of the people I was working with were really on a knife edge. These were all people who have had to flee from their homes, their towns, their countries, their cultures, their families, often with their children, after death threats or after a member of their family had actually been killed or persecuted in some way. Some of the people that I worked with had had children killed. So these people were terrified and traumatized and also incredibly courageous, filled with faith and determined to make a new life in the country that was still and is still the beacon of hope for people who are really at a loss. And that is this country, America, the country that answers people's dreams. And so they had all gathered there on the border to ask for the protection of the United States and against all legal procedure, they were denied the opportunity to ask for that asylum time and time and time and time again. Never being told no, because that everybody knows would be illegal, but being told instead, not right now. We don't have room. Come back another day. And so people were approaching multiple times a day, every day, for weeks and months and sometimes years. And meanwhile, living out on the street in the downtown area of one of the most dangerous cities of the world. Just living on the street with no protection whatsoever, except the protection that they together as a community could provide for one another.
Mm,
So there
mm,
was a lot of beauty, and there was even a lot of laughter and a lot of life, as there is wherever people gather. But there was also a lot of pain and a lot of trauma and a lot of real danger as well. So it was, yeah, it was a pretty wraparound experience.
mm. And one of the things that struck me too is that you went down there really without a clear idea of what you were going to do, right? You had no formal role. And in the book, you say, I've come to believe that this pervasive not knowing is essential to any real on-the-ground work with people whose suffering is both extreme and long-lasting. It is only when we know that we don't know, after all, that we most generally seek. So that is a pretty profound thought. Can you share a little bit more about this?
Yeah, I agree with myself on that point. I think not knowing, and more than that, knowing and accepting that we don't know is actually very fruitful ground to begin anything. And it's very countercultural. You know, we're always told we must be prepared and we do know and we must know. But in fact, it's impossible to know the reality of another um, without first meeting that person or those people. How could I know in any way other than theoretically, which is to say out of my own imagination, what it is that people in the circumstances I just outlined actually needed and how I could be helpful without first learning from them? So I went intentionally with no specific plan because for me, the most fruitful plans emerge from the encounter with another and from learning from those who I am hoping to work with and serve. And so I went down as unfettered as I could be to first listen and learn, and only then to try to respond in specificity to what people have told me they needed. They're the experts of their life, not me.
And so your role did evolve over the time that you were there. Could you describe that for folks?
Yeah, so as you said, I arrived with no clear idea what I was going to do, and I was in various places up and down the border. And then when I was in Ciudad Juarez and El Paso, um, I began to notice that people were gathering on this one particular street I walked down every day on my way to volunteer in a reception area for folks who had been sent back to Mexico from the US, from detention centers. And over the course of several days, I realized, oh, people are starting to live on this street, which had not been the case before. Um, and so I began to talk with the people. They were all Mexicans in Mexico seeking asylum in the States, largely fleeing cartel violence, which is very extreme and terrible. Um, and so as this community grew, I began to spend more and more of my time with them and ended up spending all day, every day with them, helping to serve them however I could, helping to connect them with other groups of people who could help them, legal groups and also faith communities, and then also to accompany them as they approached the actual border line, which was at the top of a bridge. It's just a literal line. And on this side of the line, it's Mexico. And on that side of the line, it's the United States. And these asylum seekers had to walk up to that line time and time again to ask Border Patrol if they could request the asylum of the United States, which very rarely happened. And so I would go with them wearing my collar and a big cross and sort of trying to use whatever minute power I had as a ordained member of the clergy and a US citizen to assist them. So those were some of the things that I did day by day, and mostly just listened to people as well, and offered classes to the kids and developed a little school in partnership with others.
Yes.
So many things, yeah.
It's amazing. I mean, talk about entrepreneurship. I mean, this is, at its grassroots level, that's for sure. Um, so a recurring theme in, actual language in your book is no one through, no one through, no one through. Can you speak a little bit about the rules for asylum seekers, what they're supposed to be, and what you actually observed?
Yeah, thank you. Those words no one through come from my journal. That's I recorded each day how many were able to request asylum, and how many were turned away and unable to request asylum. So asylum, both by US law and by international law, is a right given to any human being in terror for their life that you can approach a bordering country and ask for their protection. And these were laws that were established post-World War II. Um, and so anybody is supposed to be able to go up to someone on the border, a US representative, and say, I'm fleeing from my life. I am very afraid. I request asylum from the United States. And then they should be allowed in to pursue their asylum case. This does not mean that they're given asylum. Very, very few people are actually granted asylum, but everybody should be free to request asylum, especially people who are right then in the country, which is causing their fear and their terror, as these Mexican asylum seekers were, because they're in, of course, very immediate and real peril. But what actually happened is that these people were turned away time and time and time again. It didn't matter what their story was. It didn't matter the depth of horror, real fear. It didn't matter how impressive their claim for asylum was. They were just turned away by being told, we're too full. We have no room. go and try again another day. So it was just a delay posture institutionalized by the then administration to reduce immigration, legal immigration into the United States, because
Hmm.
this is all of these asylum seekers, and all asylum seekers are entering the country legally. These are not the people who are trying to sneak in, who have stories too, and valid stories. But these people, and the people I write about in the book, are people who are trying to do everything in the book and were being thwarted by that same book,
Hmm.
to prevent them from accessing.
Now, have you seen, obviously you're not there anymore, but I mean, have you seen or heard of any kind of an ebb and flow over the last few years in terms of changes in the rules or changes in the acceptance levels?
Well, so right now, of course, no one can request asylum at all on the southern border. No one. So the system that the Biden administration put in place to regulate people seeking asylum, it was done through an app. And so it was very difficult to get an appointment on this app. It's sort of like if you ever tried to call a radio station, to answer the question to get the free tickets, it's like that. You just have to try and try and try and try and try for weeks and months. And maybe at one point you'll get that appointment, and you'll be lucky enough in that lottery to get that appointment. And then you wait several months to apply for asylum. That app has been shut down, was shut down on the first day of this new administration. And
Hmm.
therefore, I think it's about 270,000 people, 27,000 people, must be 27,000 people, who had appointments lined up. The appointments are gone. There's nothing for them to do, and there's no other way to legally request asylum. So asylum is de facto kaput. There's no way to request it, no matter what your story is. So that's the case on the border.
Hmm.
So
Wow.
it's very different, and I haven't been there. I'm going in March, and I'm looking forward to it, but I haven't been there, and I haven't seen what it's like. But there's no flow for asylum seekers, none.
Are you planning to go in March just for a short visit or
Yeah,
longer?
just for a short visit. Yeah.
Okay. Hmm. So one of the examples you give in the book is a mother whose family was turned down for entry in the United States. So she actually got through the interview process and was told no. And you said, what are you going to do now? And she responded, go back home. What else can I do? And so you said, well, will you be safe there? To which she replied, no. First my oldest boy, then my next, and one day the little one too, will have to choose, join the cartel or be shot. Which, I can't even imagine living in such an environment. But I mean, how often did you hear things like this?
Yeah. It's such a terrible story. Every day, multiple times every day. And this is why these people were at the border.
Hmm.
In that they were imperiled, their family were imperiled, and these were, for the most part, um, people without much wealth. These were not powerful people. They were humble people, working people, taxi drivers, farmers, peanut sellers, um, small little storefront owners, and they could not survive the environment in which they lived, without being in mortal danger, literal mortal danger. So many people who were living in these makeshift tents on the street, had members of their family who had actually been killed, and some tortured. And then one man I'm thinking of now, left and brought with him his younger son, after his older son was killed, and he was sent photographs of his body. Um, did he do the right thing? He didn't know. Many of them didn't know. Many of the mothers would ask me, is this our fault that our children are suffering so much, that they're sleeping in the cold on the hard sidewalk? Have we done the right thing? Should we have stayed? I mean, the anguish and the agony, you just have to really try to imagine it in your own context, with your own family, to try to get a feel of what it would take for you to leave your home, everything you own, and take your children and go to who knows where, and you have no idea how, but you know you have to leave for their safety. All of the adults on that street were doing this for their children.
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah, there was plenty of horror to go around. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, that's clear.
And if I could say one more thing, the people on the street were oftentimes the people who were sort of somewhat burdened by a real sense of justice and dignity. So that
Hmm.
these were the people, the leaders in their community who refused to fall into the corrupt systems and the violent systems that had basically taken over their hometowns. So these were the leaders of their community. They were people who organized others to stand up against corruption, and therefore they were targeted. So they were quite specifically extraordinary people who were there at the
Hmm.
border, people who I would tell them over and over again, especially the children, my country is so lucky that we have a chance that you might live in our country because
Hmm.
they make our country so much stronger and better.
Hmm. Amen. So, the Episcopal Church eventually put together a permanent role.
Yeah.
Um, I think it had to be because of seeing all the amazing work that you did. Quite frankly, you don't claim that in the book, but it seemed kind of clear to me. Um, but that also kind of, in some sense, drove your choice to leave the border. That as well as, I mean, you had to be incredibly burnt out by then.
Well, actually, so I was working in partnership with the Episcopal Diocese of the Rio Grande from, my first days there. And then as this ministry on the street in Juarez developed, I was always in communication with the Episcopal Diocese. And then after a very short amount of time, we began working together to get the funds to hire someone full time. So that was always part of the plan. I did stay until, and I'm very grateful for them and for the work that continues there today and tomorrow. And thanks be to God for that and for them. Um, I stayed there until the last person from this tent community on the street was able to request asylum.
Hmm.
The community was demolished one day in January 2020 by the Mexican government. They just came in and bulldozed the community. Um, and so that community scattered. Many went to an Anglican church in Juarez, others scattered all over. But I stayed working with them, even in a fractured community geographically, until every single person had had the opportunity to
Hmm.
request asylum.
Wow.
And then I left straight after that. Yeah.
And so how long was the total time that you were down there?
I was down on the border for almost a year, but
Okay.
this community arrived, formed, grew, peaked, and then was destroyed all in 4 months.
Oh,
So
in 4 months.
so
Okay.
this book traces 4 months worth of work.
Okay. Wow. It wasn't clear to me, exactly how long that
Yeah,
span was.
very short. It was pretty intense.
Yes, yes. Yeah, you had a lot to talk about within that 4 month period, that's for
Yeah.
certain. So what would you like readers to most take away from the book?
I think, I mean, clearly how extraordinary most of these people who are seeking asylum in this country are. The fact that they have had to flee their homes suggests that they are extremely upright citizens, and courageous, extremely courageous and faith-filled. I can't imagine doing it without believing in a higher power of some kind, and especially with sort of believing that you're being held in the loving arms of God, which people on the street most certainly did, and they taught me a lot about faith. So that's the first thing, that asylum seekers are, in fact, um, more extraordinary than most people, the opposite of what we're being told by the current
Mm,
administration.
mm,
And many, many children, and children are children, that children are children wherever they are, beautiful and filled with hope and joy and laughter and genius. And then secondly, I think, um, especially for people of faith, that we can bring our faith into the most terrible of circumstances and the darkest of circumstances, and it can help us. So I think, one of my great passions is sort of dissolving the walls of our churches and allowing our churches to become more at one with the world around us, and particularly with the suffering of the world around us, and also the joys, because those things are very linked, of course. So that's very much part of what I hoped this book would do. I wrote this book not as a journalist, but as a priest. And so there's a lot of talk in there about faith and the struggles that the faith creates and then answers. So that's the second thing, that um, people don't need to be afraid to bring their faith into the real world. It will help them, and it will also help others. Yeah.
Hmm. Hmm. So one of the platforms that I lead is called Find Your Next Calling, where we talk about being called to go in a whole different direction. And you've clearly done that a few times in your life. Can you talk a little bit about what led to, major changes like that, and kind of like what type of discernment process, if any, that you used for that?
Two big questions. My first, I would reply with a question first, though. I don't know that I've gone in completely different directions. I feel like it's all one direction.
Okay.
Um, and that so being a journalist and being a priest are not so very different for me. Both of them involve lots of sitting around, meeting people, listening, learning. The real difference for me is being a journalist, your work is then to write what you learn and reflect it to the readers over here. And the work of the priest is to reflect what you learn, which is the beautiful and essential nature of each person you're meeting back to the person you meet. So it's
Hmm.
quite different in that part, but the skills of the work seem to me to be quite the same.
Hmm.
And the kind of journalism I did and the kind of priest that I am also keeps me in community with people who are largely on the margins and struggling and suffering. So there's not much change there either.
Hmm.
I have spent some incredibly beautiful time in a parish in Western Mass, Grace Church, and I love that parish and I love all the people there. But again, the work is one of encounter and learning and growing together in community. So there've been different expressions or manifestations of what I think is my central call, but I hope and I pray that the call is one, and that I've been able to, I'm a bit of a zigzagger, but that in that zigzag there is some faithfulness in its heart.
Hmm. Well, just, I mean, the practical aspects of, working with homeless people or being at the Mexican border or working with people in prison, just the practical. And I mean,
Yeah.
again, I'm an engineer, so I think about, those aspects of it being quite different, but I understand what you're saying in terms of the core value not changing.
Yeah, and it's true. I think what it does take a certain amount of courage to change the expression of your work. And it's not always easy. It can be quite scary. But I guess I would say if you feel you're called to do it, you must do it because we only live once. So do it. Be not
Good for
afraid.
you. Good for you. Well, another thing, is writing, right? So a lot of the folks in our audience are aspiring writers or relatively new writers. What kind of advice do you have for them?
Right. I think the only way to become a writer is to write, and to write with some sort of hard-assness, and discipline. And I think in my life, there's not all that much time around the edges of things. So there are things you have to say no to in order to say yes to
Hmm.
making time and space for yourself to write. Um, and that's the first thing, really. And then the second thing is, for me, I find it very, very helpful to be in community in everything I do. And so to have a writers group, or even what helped me with this book was to be online with 3 or 4 dear friends and to write every morning. We all had different jobs. We were all working on different projects. We didn't speak to each other at this time, but we kind of operated as our egos for each other, so that we all met at 7 or 7:30 and we wrote till 8:30 every morning. And if you didn't show up, people knew. And for me, that's really, really helpful. But again, that's just in the service of writing and writing and writing, and having some kind of need to write, need to discover what it is that you need to discover through the writing.
Hmm.
Yeah, I think, what do you think? That's the only thing I can think of that makes a person a writer.
Well, I mean, the process that you just described, I've heard several other folks say similar things.
Mm.
And I'm not a writer. So, believe it or not, um, I just work with a lot of writers. So, I realize you just recently launched this book, but do you have any future plans, whether it's books or other kinds of zigzags in direction that you can talk about?
I don't have a book that I'm thinking of right now. There's a sort of long list of books I'd like to write or edit or pull together, but I can only really do one thing at a time in that realm. Um, but I have started a new work with the Massachusetts Council of Churches. It's one of many councils of churches across the country, and working to help coordinate congregations and congregants to work in support of asylum seekers and other newly arrived neighbors here in this state. So I'm pretty much focused on doing that right now. It feels sort of like urgent work and important work. Um, so that and to keep a life of prayer active and open, those are my two main goals
Hmm.
for this year at least.
Good for you. Good for you. Well, again, the title of Christina's book, The Asylum Seekers, A Chronicle of Life, Death, and Community at the Border. Please go check it out and go to broadleafbooks.com. Christina, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much for all of your work. It's quite impressive and inspiring.
Thank you so much, Brian. Really, very, very grateful to have been with you.
Oh, thank you.